How
Yeah.
bad is this going to get?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the pity of war. I've spent my career trying to understand the great conflicts. And I don't think our world is so different from the world of 1914.
That is my fear. I was hoping you were going to say, "Oh, no, I'm reworking it." It has no relevance because,
well, the Middle East was a major bone of contention in 1914, as were the Black Sea Straits. They called it a world war for a reason. And the question that we must ask ourselves is, how close to World War III are we right now? The difference between now and 1914 is nuclear weapons and the relatively few powers that possess them, certainly at scale. And that's why up until today, really, I've been saying it's more Cold War II than World War III. And it's Cold War II now, I think it has been for 5 years, because the United States and China are the only two superpowers. I'm not talking anymore about nuclear weapons, though they're important still, but they're the only AI superpowers. They're the only real economic titans, which also have a military to go with it. So it's really a bipolar world. We're not returning to 1914, a world of multiple empires. It's a two superpower world. And in Cold War II, as in Cold War I, the two superpowers are ideologically opposed to one another, but they are also economically opposed, and they're geopolitically opposed, and they're engaged in an arms race in multiple domains. And the questions are always the same about Cold Wars. What is the probability it becomes a hot war? That was always a latent possibility in Cold War I, and I think it is in Cold War II as well. I'll just add a couple of thoughts to see if we get to a workable applied history analogy. For me, the war in Ukraine is like the Korean War, which was the first hot war of Cold War I, and the moment of revelation for many Americans who'd been in denial about the fact that there was a Cold War. They realized when Stalin backed the North Korean invasion of South Korea, and when the Chinese joined in the war, that there was something pretty serious going on, and the World War II alliance was firmly dead. I think the next sequence, the next event in our Cold War is this new war in the Middle East. There is a connection because not only Iran, but I think Russia is also a player in this Middle Eastern crisis. The key issue that hasn't yet dropped, but I think may, is the third conflict that I anticipate over Taiwan, which could, I think, happen as early as next year. And that is, I think, the nightmare scenario that the United States confronts simultaneously: a conflict in Eastern Europe, or if you like, in the North Atlantic, a conflict in the Middle East, or if you like, in the Persian Gulf, and then a conflict in the Far East around the Taiwan Strait. That's what I call the three bodies of water problem that the United States could not cope with. That combination of conflicts simultaneously, I'm not even sure we can cope with two, which is the real risk that has surfaced in the last week.
It used to be called, the strategy used to be called win, hold, win, which a friend of mine who was a military analyst was called win, hold, lose. And that was two. And that was back in the 90s. So the idea then that China would be, shall we say, opportunistic in deciding that everything had coincided nicely for them to dethrone America as the primary geopolitical force projector, and that everybody's on board with it because everybody's happy with an America diminished. And they're not wrong, are they? I mean, I don't mean to say the Donald Trump thing and say they're smart, which means some people, I guess, take that as an endorsement, but wouldn't it be the smart thing for China to just say, now's the time?
Well, it wasn't hard to predict that there would be a conflict in the Middle East this year. And I talked about it back in January. And not just in terms of the narrow issues of Israel and Gaza and the West Bank and Lebanon, but because there was an opportunity for Iran that the Biden administration created by easing the sanctions and inexplicably, to me, trying to resuscitate the obviously dead nuclear deal. And this gave Iran some real breathing space. It had been getting thoroughly choked under the Trump administration. And Iran has, I think, seized the opportunity, not just of Israeli division, but of American distraction and the fundamental equivocation that characterizes the Biden administration. We're all supposed to believe what a terrific chap Joe Biden is because he stood by Ukraine and will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. But actually, they expected Ukraine to lose, belatedly started arming it when it didn't lose, and have not given Ukraine enough to win. Enough not to lose so far, but not enough to win. And I think the Iranians understood, because they were in close contact with the Russians, indeed they're helping the Russians, they understood that this was a terrific opportunity. I don't think Joe Biden or his national security team are very eager to get involved in a war in the Middle East. They may have to if the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, cannot cope simultaneously with conflict in Gaza, the West Bank, and an assault from Hezbollah from Lebanon. But they don't really want to. And that's why they go around saying, we have no evidence that Iran was directly involved, which is a lie. It's obvious that Iran was directly involved. Iran is the sole sponsor of Palestinian Islamic Jihad. It is a major funder of Hamas. The idea that the Iranians were somehow surprised, as the New York Times reported the other day, is bunkum and absurd. Nobody should believe it. They say it because they're desperate to avoid having to intervene in this conflict too. And I fear that that is precisely what the Iranians and the Russians understand about the administration and about the United States generally, because I think the administration is kind of reflecting a general reluctance on the part of Americans to get involved in wars just about anywhere if they can avoid it.
Hey, Neil, to return to the military question, China and the military question, as you said a moment ago, you're not sure we can handle two fronts, let alone three. And it is explicit American military doctrine that our forces are disposed or meant to be able to carry on major operations in two theaters at once. And as you rightly point out, Pacific is one, North Atlantic is another, and the Med makes three. We're already, in a certain sense, overstretched. Okay. Question is as follows. We have been hearing, I believe you subscribe to this argument yourself, but we've been hearing that the defense of Taiwan runs through Ukraine, that we have to help the Ukrainians because the Chinese are watching. How does that argument apply to the Middle East? I'll close with just correct me if you'll know more about this than I do. It used to be, we have 11 carriers. It used to be the rule of thumb that 1/3 is always in port undergoing repairs. 1/3 is someplace that it's going to take a lot of time to get them from, steaming to station. You only have about 1/3, 3 or 4 carriers at a time that are where they're meant to be. We already have one carrier group in the Eastern Med. Another is steaming to the Eastern Med. Are the Chinese, so the argument is, does the defense of Taiwan go through the Mediterranean? Must we secure the Israeli northern flank, so to speak, tie down Hezbollah with carriers and planes in the air? Or are the Chinese looking at this and saying, my, put them in the Med and they're not in the Pacific?
Yeah, and it's not just aircraft carrier groups one needs to talk about with respect to Taiwan, because those aircraft carriers would be very vulnerable in the event of a conflict with China. Unlike in the 1990s, the Chinese actually could sink aircraft carriers with their land-based missiles. So a lot would hinge actually on our ability to get attack submarines into the theater. To go back to my Cold War analogy, worry a lot that we seem drawn to reenacting the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan, call it the Taiwan semiconductor crisis, but we get to be the Soviets, i.e., in this scenario, it's the communist power that blockades the island. We called it a quarantine around Cuba in 1962, but it was a blockade. And it's our turn to send the Naval Expeditionary Force a very long way to run the blockade, risking World War III, which of course was what Khrushchev did. And he ultimately backed down. There was a deal done, if you recall, involving missiles in Turkey, but that was secret. Publicly, he appeared to back down, and it did a huge amount of damage to his credibility, and it made the Soviets feel that they'd been humiliated, and thereafter they really ramped up their spending on their nuclear arsenal. So why would we want to rerun the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan when it was the closest we came to World War III in the first Cold War? I don't know. Seems like a terrible idea, but we have been consistently now for several years arguing in ways that imply we don't believe in strategic ambiguity anymore. We want to make an unambiguous commitment to Taiwan. The president has done this on at least 3, if not 4 occasions. It's been walked back later, but you know what the Chinese are thinking. When the president of the United States sounds like he's ditched strategic ambiguity, that's what you take note of. So I think we've put ourselves in a very overstretched position, and it was avoidable. There was no particular need to say, we don't really believe in strategic ambiguity anymore. There was no need for Nancy Pelosi to grandstand in Taiwan and act, as far as the mainland Chinese could see, as if it's an independent country de facto. All of this, I think, could have been avoided, but it's created a situation which is very, very different from the situation 22 years ago. Because after 9/11, David Frum sort of made up an axis of evil, and it didn't exist. It was a great speech line, and you're a speech writer, Peter. You'll know why it was a great speech line, but it was a fiction. There is an axis now. There is a proper concerted relationship between Russia, Iran, and China. I don't know what the Chinese are thinking about this Middle Eastern crisis. They are in some ways the biggest member of the axis and also the least influential, because I don't think they really call the shots about what happens in Ukraine or the Middle East.